Here is the thing about great power competitions. The outcome is almost never decided by the battle that everyone is watching. It is decided quietly, structurally, years or decades earlier, by a set of choices that looked at the time like perfectly reasonable decisions. Most people who watch the headlines about America and China see a competition still in progress, tariffs being announced, semiconductor export controls being tightened, diplomatic warnings being exchanged, military assets being repositioned across the Pacific. What they do not see, what the coverage almost never names plainly, is that the structural outcome of this competition was locked in more than 2 decades ago. Not by military force, not by war, by a single decision made in a conference room in Geneva in November 2001. A decision that every trade minister in the world celebrated. A decision that most economists called the beginning of a new era of global prosperity. That decision created the world we now live in, and it handed one of these two powers a structural advantage so foundational that no tariff, no export ban, no diplomatic confrontation can fully undo it in any time frame that actually matters. The real winner of the America-China competition is not determined by who has the bigger military. It is not determined by whose currency outlasts the other. It is determined by who controls the productive base of the global economy, and that race, the one that actually decides the outcome, was already run. What follows is exactly how it happened, why both governments are still behaving as though it hasn't, and what that tells you about every headline you are reading right now. Layer 1, the productive economy. Who makes things? Who processes raw materials? Who controls the supply chains that feed every other system? Layer 2, the financial economy. Who controls the currency? Who sets the rules of global trade? Who can cut you off from the system with a phone call? Layer 3, the institutional economy. Who writes the norms? Who builds the alliances? Who defines what the rules even are? China has won Layer 1, and the data is not subtle about it. The United Nations Industrial Development Organization, as of 2023, puts China's share of global manufacturing output at 18.4%. America's sights at 15.9%. That gap does not sound dramatic until you understand what manufacturing actually is in a modern great power confrontation. It is not just consumer goods. It is the capacity to build weapons, supply armies, feed populations, and sustain a civilization through a prolonged strategic conflict. By the end of this analysis, you will understand the America-China competition better than nearly everyone discussing it on any major network. But there is something specific, a single decision made in a single room on a single day that made the outcome of this competition mathematically inevitable before most people alive today had ever heard the word geopolitics. Here is what changes everything. Every single analyst who was present when this decision was made called it a victory. And they were right. They just had no idea which side had actually won. The month was November. The year was 2001. The place was Doha, Qatar. After 15 years of negotiations, the World Trade Organization voted to admit the People's Republic of China as a full member. 142 nations applauded. The Clinton administration had spent 8 years engineering it. The Bush administration delivered it. The logic was straightforward. Integrate China into the global trading system, and China becomes a stakeholder in that system. Trade creates interdependence. Interdependence creates stability. Stability prevents war. That logic was not wrong. It was simply incomplete in a way that history has since made brutally clear. What the architects of that decision failed to model was scale. China didn't just join the global trading system. It captured the productive layer of it. Systematically, deliberately, with a patience that has no Western political equivalent. Between 2001 and 2010, China's share of global manufacturing doubled. Between 2001 and 2023, the United States shed 5 million manufacturing jobs, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Those jobs did not disappear into thin air. They were absorbed into Shenzhen, Chongqing, Guangzhou, Dongguan, into an industrial ecosystem built with a speed and at a scale that has no precedent in recorded economic history. Harvard professor Graham Allison coined the term Thucydides trap to describe what happens when a rising power threatens to displace an established one. His research, published in Destined for War in 2017, found that of 16 such historical confrontations in the past 500 years, 12 ended in major war. Allison described the probability of conflict in this case as, in his precise words, dangerously high. That is not the language of a man making casual assessments, but here is where most readings of Allison stop short. And this is the part that matters. The Thucydides trap assumes both powers are competing for the same thing. Athens and Sparta were both competing for dominance of the Greek world. Britain and Germany were both competing for maritime supremacy. The assumption built into the trap is symmetry. America and China are not competing for the same thing. That asymmetry is precisely why every standard prediction keeps producing wrong outcomes. Then came 2008. The global financial crisis, which originated in American mortgage markets and propagated through the dollar-denominated financial system, did something to Chinese strategic thinking that no political event could have achieved alone. It made the vulnerability of the dollar-based system visible to Beijing's planners with a clarity that no academic paper could have produced. The People's Bank of China's research papers from 2009, publicly available, cited in full by Western economists at the time, explicitly recommended reducing dependence on the dollar as the global reserve currency. This was not conspiracy. It was published institutional policy, drafted in direct response to watching Lehman Brothers collapse and take a generation of global financial confidence with it. Xi Jinping, upon assuming the position of General Secretary in 2012, described China's objective not as defeating America, but as achieving what he called the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. That framing matters precisely because it reframes the competition. The target was not parity with American power. The target was restoration of what China's governing class understands to be its civilization's natural historical position. The historical parallel that most accurately mirrors this moment is not the Cold War. It is the 4 decades between 1870 and 1914, when the United States was quietly and systematically surpassing Britain as the world's leading industrial economy, while Britain's financial prestige and military reputation still made it appear dominant to every outside observer. The productive shift happened first. The recognition of that shift followed only after the catastrophe of the First World War made it impossible to deny. Britain's financial layer outlasted its productive dominance by approximately 2 decades, and then it did not outlast it anymore. Here is where your wallet enters the story, because this strategic competition is not abstract. It is showing up in your electricity bill, your phone price, your grocery receipt, and the interest rate on your mortgage. Start with semiconductors, because this is where the conflict is most visible and most consistently misread. In October 2022, the Biden administration announced sweeping export controls on advanced semiconductors and chip manufacturing equipment destined for China, the most aggressive trade restriction America had imposed on any country since the Cold War. The logic was clear: constrain China's access to advanced chips, and you constrain its military and artificial intelligence development simultaneously. Here is the counterintuitive reality that the coverage rarely confronts directly. The Semiconductor Industry Association reported in January 2024 that China's domestic chip production capacity grew by 12% in the single year following those export controls. Not contracted, grew. Because restrictions accelerated exactly what China's planners had been attempting for a decade: the construction of a fully sovereign semiconductor supply chain, one that requires no American components, no American equipment, no American permission. The Huawei case is the lesson no one wants to apply. When America cut Huawei off from American technology in 2019, the expectation was that the company would retreat or collapse under the weight of its dependencies. Instead, by August 2023, Huawei released the Mate 60 Pro, a smartphone running a 7-nanometer chip fabricated entirely by SMIC, China's state-backed domestic manufacturer. Without a single piece of American equipment in the production line, the chip is not best in class, but it proved the principle that the entire containment strategy was designed to disprove. Now connect that to rare earths, because most people never make that connection, and they should. China controls 60% of global rare earth mining, according to the United States Geological Survey as of 2023. But the number that actually changes the strategic calculus is not mining, it is processing. China controls 85% of global rare earth processing capacity. These are the materials inside every electric vehicle motor, every wind turbine generator, every precision-guided munition in every major military's inventory. No F-35 flies without them. No advanced battery stores energy without them. In April 2023, China announced export restrictions on gallium and germanium, 2 materials fundamental to semiconductor manufacturing and military-grade electronics. The Department of Defense's own supply chain assessment, published in February 2024, confirmed that the United States has 0 domestic processing capacity for either material. 0. That single word deserves to sit with you for a moment. The costs of this competition are not borne by governments. They are borne by households. The average price of consumer electronics in the United States has increased 14% since 2021, according to the Bureau of Economic Analysis. a period that maps precisely onto the beginning of supply chain diversification away from Chinese manufacturing. The tariff structures announced in the spring of 2025, the most sweeping since the Smoot-Hawley Act of 1930, translate, according to the Yale Budget Lab's April 2025 analysis, to an estimated $1,700 in additional annual costs for the average American household. That is the price of strategic competition transferred directly to the family budget. And here is the structural asymmetry that makes this genuinely consequential. When America imposes costs on China through tariffs and export controls, those costs are real. But China possesses a mechanism for absorbing them that no democratic government can replicate. A centralized industrial policy that directs investment, subsidizes targeted sectors, and accepts years of short-term pain in exchange for long-term strategic positioning. The Chinese government has injected over $47 billion into domestic semiconductor development since 2014, according to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. No government with a 4-year electoral cycle and a free press can deploy that kind of patient, sustained capital. The second major mechanism is the dollar itself. And this is where the story reaches its most consequential layer. Here is the part that nobody on any major network has framed correctly. What is happening to the dollar right now is not a currency story. It is a trust story. And trust, once it begins to erode, moves with extraordinary and compounding speed. The dollar's position as the world's reserve currency is not a natural law. It is a political arrangement, one that was constructed in 1944 at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, and has been maintained not by gold, not by treaty, but by two things: American military projection and the absence of a credible alternative. Both of those foundations are now being tested simultaneously for the first time since 1944. In 2022, following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the United States and its Western allies froze approximately $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves, assets held in Western financial institutions, denominated in dollars and euros, believed by their holders to be sovereign property. The message was intended for Moscow, but it was received with extraordinary attention by every non-Western central bank on the planet. The message, stripped of diplomatic language, was this: dollar reserves are held at America's discretion, not yours. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, now expanded to include Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Ethiopia, Iran, and Egypt as of January 2024, accelerated discussions about alternative settlement systems at a pace that had no precedent. The share of global trade settled in dollars has declined from 52% in 2001 to 47% in 2023, according to SWIFT data. That is a slow movement. Slow movements in reserve currencies are the only kind that happen, right until the moment they stop being slow. The historical parallel here demands direct engagement. In 1918, the British pound was still the dominant global reserve currency. By 1944, it was not. That transition from global reserve to secondary currency unfolded across 26 years and was driven almost entirely by a shift in productive power, not military power. The country that made more things eventually set the rules. Britain's financial prestige outlasted its productive dominance by approximately 2 decades. The timeline matters. Before the next section, something deserves a full stop. Behind every statistic in this analysis are real people whose lives are being shaped by decisions made in capitals they will never visit. The 400 million people in China lifted from poverty between 1990 and 2020, the most rapid poverty reduction in recorded human history according to the World Bank, did so because of the very productive integration this analysis is describing. The 5 million American manufacturing workers who lost their livelihoods across that same period were not collateral damage in someone's abstract grand strategy. They were people, families, communities that have not economically recovered, and in many cases may not in any foreseeable timeline. That human reality sits behind every tariff announcement, every export control, every diplomatic confrontation being broadcast right now. Both governments speak in the language of national interest. Neither government fully accounts for the costs its own citizens absorb in the name of that interest. The worst-case scenario, and this requires precise framing, not alarm, is not a conventional military confrontation. Strategic analysts at Rand Corporation in their 2023 assessment placed the probability of direct military conflict over Taiwan within a 10-year window at approximately 20 to 30%. That figure has not declined since publication, but the scenario that is simultaneously more probable and, in structural terms, more consequential than war is permanent bifurcation. 2 parallel technological ecosystems, 2 parallel payment systems, 2 parallel frameworks for what the internet is and who governs it. A world in which a chip manufactured in Shanghai cannot run software developed in San Jose, not by accident, but by deliberate design, in which the global economic integration of the last 30 years reverses into two large, systemically incompatible blocks, and every nation on Earth is forced to position itself between them or lose access to both. The countries of Southeast Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America did not design this competition. They did not request it. They are its terrain. And the decisions being made in Washington and Beijing are being made, in large part, without meaningful consultation with the 6 billion people whose lives will be shaped by their outcomes. That asymmetry between who makes the decisions and who lives inside their consequences is not a side note to this story. It is the story. Step back from all of this for a moment, because when you lay the 3 layers against the timeline, against the specific decisions that cannot be reversed, what emerges is something neither government's official position will acknowledge. Both sides have made the same fundamental miscalculation. The question is not which empire wins. The question is which empire is still standing when the cost of winning finally becomes visible. What this analysis asks of you is not fear. Fear is not a useful response to structural analysis. What is useful is clarity, a clear map of the system you are living inside. Because when you understand the structure, you can see what is coming before it is announced. And in a world changing at this speed, that is the most valuable thing available. Now, the counter-argument deserves a fair and serious hearing, because analysts with serious credentials look at everything described above and arrive somewhere considerably calmer. Their argument is not unreasonable. China's demographic position is structurally and, in the near term, irreversibly compromised. The workforce peaked in 2011. The population itself began contracting in 2022, for the first time since the Great Leap Forward. The property sector, which represented approximately 25% of GDP at its height, remains in a prolonged contraction that policy interventions have not successfully stabilized. An economy managing a declining workforce, a contracting domestic demand base, and an increasingly adversarial export environment is not the profile of a civilization at the peak of its ascent. That argument is grounded in real data. The honest acknowledgement of that argument is this: it is not wrong. It is simply operating on the wrong timeline for the strategic question being asked. Demographic decline does not reverse productive capacity in the short or medium term. The factories are built. The supply chains are operational. The rare earth processing infrastructure exists and is running. A declining population affects future capacity, 20, 30 years from now. It does not diminish present capability. And in a 10 to 15-year strategic window, which is the relevant window for the decisions being made today, present productive capability is what determines the outcome. The honest picture, stripped of both alarm and complacency, is this: America retains decisive advantages in the financial layer and the institutional layer. Its alliance network, NATO, the Quad, the partnerships being rebuilt across the Indo-Pacific, represents a depth of strategic relationships that China has not come close to assembling. The frontier of artificial intelligence, large language models, autonomous systems, next-generation chip design remains, as of early 2026, anchored in American and allied research institutions. These are not small advantages. China retains decisive advantages in the productive layer. Those advantages are structural, built across 3 decades of deliberate industrial policy, and cannot be reversed by any measure a democratic government can sustain across electoral cycles. The rare earth processing monopoly, the manufacturing ecosystem, the domestic supply chain independence, these are not negotiable away with tariffs or export controls operating on a 4-year political timeline. This is not a competition heading toward a clean winner. It is a competition with a specific structural shape. 2 powers, each dominant in a different layer, each attempting to project their dominance into the other's layer, both discovering that the cost of that extension is far higher than either public has been told. Here is what to watch, because these 3 signals will tell you the direction of resolution before any headline does. Watch the volume of global trade settled outside the dollar system. If BRICS-aligned payment mechanisms begin clearing above $500 billion annually in sustained volume, the reserve currency transition has moved from theoretical to structural. Watch China's semiconductor self-sufficiency trajectory. If domestic Chinese fabrication breaks the 5-nanometer barrier at production scale, the export control containment strategy has failed at its primary objective. Watch Taiwan, not for military movements, but for capital. Watch where TSMC, Intel, and Samsung are directing their next fabrication investments. Capital discloses the real assessment before any government statement does. Most people watching this competition are asking who wins. That is the wrong question. The question is what the winning costs, and whether the winner can absorb the bill. History gives us the map. The map says great power transitions are almost never decided by the confrontations everyone is watching. They are decided quietly, structurally, irreversibly, long before the confrontation becomes impossible to ignore. This decision was made in Geneva. in November 2001. Everything since then has been the consequence playing out. The question is not which empire wins. The question is which empire is still standing when the cost of winning finally becomes visible.